Seashell, Georgetown, Bahamas, winter '86. There were three main beaches in Georgetown: Volleyball Beach on the west side of Stocking Island, Hamburger Beach, named for a little burger shack run by the Peace and Plenty Hotel, and the Ocean Beach on the Exuma Sound side of Stocking Island, facing east. The ocean beach was about a mile and a half long, with patches of reef where the ocean broke in foamy waves. The cruising mothers took their dinghies to one beach or another with their kids almost every afternoon, so they could body surf or swim or build sand forts and bomb each other with sand balls. I guess we were making up for the lack of social company that we experienced in other places. The mothers, for the most part, were just happy to escape their husbands and the tight confines of life aboard a boat for a few hours. We'd visited Georgetown the year before, and it, either by chance or by our parents' choice, became our place to socialize. For a month or so out of every year, Georgetown meant social structure, planned activities such as the annual cruising regatta, weekly potlucks on the beach, afternoon volleyball. For that, my dad resented it. Social structure was what he had taken his family cruising to avoid, and the social structure that was there, he said, wasn't the healthy kind. It was the kind where people did whatever they wanted, partying all day and drinking at noon, rather than waiting until a respectable hour like 6 o'clock. It was the kind of social structure, he said, where adults acted like kids, forgetting responsibilities such as taking care of their boats and finding ways to make money. The other kids were fun to be around, but I didn't like any of them that much. They were all more athletic than I was, and they wanted to play games that involved running. I was happier sitting alone and thinking, making up elaborate stories about characters I'd created. The day I met Michelle, I was wandering Ocean Beach, lost in my own head, singing one of the only songs I knew from my parents' collection of cassette tapes. It was Jimmy Buffett's Son of a Sailor. I couldn't remember all the words, so I made them up as I went. A flurry of motion coming from the sand dunes interrupted my singing. I couldn't tell what it was at first, because the sea oats were thick and tangled at the edge of the beach, and the movement was just behind them. Then a wall of sand sprayed out like a boat wake, and a girl about my age tumbled down the dune, rolling over and then somehow landing on her feet right next to me. Her skin was the same color as the sea oats, and she had a sunburned nose and bright green eyes and a mess of black hair. "I know that song," she said. Her voice was squeaky and didn't seem to quite fit her body. She pushed the mop of hair away from her eyes and blinked at me, like it was amazing that we both knew the same song. Lots of parents listened to Jimmy Buffett, especially parents who lived on boats, but somehow this was different. We sang it together, pulling the words out of our new collective memory, and became inseparable. Michelle was grown up at 6. She and her father Gary lived aboard a 30-foot O'Day sloop called Indian Summer. It was close to being the smallest boat in Georgetown. Her mother had cruised with them for a while, but at that point she had moved off the boat and was spending all her time back in Michigan. I don't know when their divorce was actually finalized. Gary ran an auto repair shop back in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. During the summers, he bought, fixed, and sold junk cars, and a buddy of his ran the shop during the winter so that Gary could sail. I was jealous of the things he let Michelle do. She had her own rowing dinghy, and there was talk that she might even get an outboard motor for it. She rowed it and sailed it around the anchorages off of Stocking Island all by herself. My parents were more cautious. They wouldn't let me take a rowing dinghy out by myself. They wanted to be sure that I knew how to row, so they tied the dinghy off the stern of New and had me row back and forth behind the boat. It's how I learned to row, my dad said. What if you got caught in the current and couldn't get back? You'd wish you were tied to the boat. This was typical, overly cautious, worst-case scenario dad. Michelle sailed circles around New in her dinghy. She came over to tease me, telling me how dumb I looked, wearing my life jacket, sitting in a tethered rowboat. One day I was rowing as hard as I could against the tether, trying to see if I could make the big boat move, pretending to be a tugboat captain. Michelle rowed over to me in her dinghy. "We are going to town," she said. "My dad wants to take you with us." My parents leaned over the lifeline of New, worried. "When will you be back?" Dad asked. "I don't know before sunset," Michelle said. "We just need to get some fuel and water and food and stuff. He said he'd buy us burgers at Frida's." "Oh no," Mom said. "My family had a rule against buying burgers anywhere in town because the burgers were cooked on outdoor grills and were supposedly encrusted with flies. Dad told us they were made of goat meat, and he always made sure to point out that the local goat population was a little smaller each time we made a trip to town." Dad went over in the big dinghy to talk to Gary, I guess to make sure the boat wasn't about to sink and to give Gary some lunch money from me. Dad probably interrogated Gary, threatened him, or at least shook him up a little, but Gary never let on. Michelle and I climbed aboard New so I could change clothes and grab an extra life jacket. Carolyn threw a tantrum because she wasn't allowed to go. She screamed and tried to bite me, but I managed to push her off. Her teeth were sharp like a puppy's, and they scraped my arm. She took a fistful of her sun-streaked brown hair and pulled it out, still screaming, "I hate you," she said, throwing the hair at us. I'm not sure whether it was directed at Michelle or me. "Why can't I go?" Mom held her by the elbow and said, "You can do things with your friends too, and Melanie doesn't have to go with you." She guided Carolyn off to draw pictures at the salon table. Indian Summer was much smaller than New, and the small engine under the cockpit rattled the whole boat. I knew Gary would rather have sailed the mile across Elizabeth Harbor to Georgetown, but there was no wind. He made sure the companionway hatch was open so Michelle and I had plenty of fresh air while the engine sputtered exhaust into the cabin. We sat on the floor where Michelle crafted a friendship bracelet out of blue and purple embroidery floss. I wanted some pink in it too, but she insisted that pink wasn't my color. When she tied the bracelet around my ankle, I thought it was the prettiest piece of jewelry I'd ever seen. I swore I'd never take it off. "Dad," Michelle called up to the companionway, "can we listen to Jimmy Buffett?" "You know how to work the tape player," Gary said. He was intent on navigating the boat safely across the harbor, and he only took his eyes off the water long enough to look down at us and smile. A smile I learned he only reserved for his daughter. I learned a lot of things about Michelle's family over the next 15 years. When Gary worked in the auto shop during the summers, he took Michelle in with him and let her crawl around among the mechanics and tools and grease. The mechanics called her Bondo Baby because she always got herself covered with the thick putty used in auto body repair. Michelle's mom, Kathy, was beautiful and wispy, and while I believe that she and Gary never fell out of love with each other, their divorce was ugly. It was never clear to me whether Gary or Kathy had legal custody of Michelle. We listened to Buffett's song, "You Know by Heart," and it was the first time I heard "Why Don't We Get Drunk and Screw," a song that my parents had dubbed over on our own copy of the tape. I thought it was odd that our tape was missing the track, but didn't think the song was that great. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. Michelle and I screamed along with Son of a Sailor," and even though Gary laughed at us, I think he was secretly thrilled. Over in Georgetown, Gary docked the boat at Exuma Services, the town's only marina. Michelle and I spilled off the boat and ran down the dock without our shoes. Gary yelling something to us about not getting splinters. Michelle found a group of Bohemian kids who were out of school on their lunch break, running around in their starched uniforms. They chased the scrawny chickens that darted under our feet. My parents never gave Carolyn and me a chance to play with the Bahamian kids. Trips into Georgetown with my parents were usually all business. Gary was the opposite of my dad. Dad was careful and conscientious. He dressed up to go to town, made sure to shake hands with the right people, and carried a soft briefcase whenever he went to Batelco, the Bahamian phone company. The Batelco office was the only place on the island where you could make and receive phone calls to and from the States. Gary wore cut-off jeans and didn't mind showing off his beer gut. He laughed a lot more than my dad did, and he knew different types of people. Gary ordered for us at Frida's. We sat at a long picnic table and watched as the burgers sizzled over the open grill. I tried to find the goats, and Gary pointed to where they were tied next to a small pink house. I'd have to tell my dad that the goats were alive and well. The burgers here are so good because they come from Venezuela, Gary told us, and you have to get everything on them. He left the table and went over to the grill, pulled some wet $5 bills from his pocket, and turned his back to us so we couldn't see what he was putting on the burgers. The smell of beef and charcoal and burnt drippings wrapped around Gary's big body and drifted across the dry grass and sandburrs to our table. Michelle swatted a fly with her hand and wiped it off on the bench, leaving a black smear. "You just wait," she said. "This will be the best burger you've ever had." My stomach rolled over a couple of times. When Gary turned around, we saw 3 paper plates stacked with burgers that might as well have reached the clouds. The top of each bun was sliding off because there was so much stuff piled underneath. Mayo on the bottom, then the burger, then cheese, ketchup, pickles, onions, lettuce, tomatoes, and mayo, and mustard on top. "And here's more ketchup," Gary said. He set the plates down in front of us. I could barely get my hands around my burger. Michelle's hands were the same size as mine, but she ate hers like a pro, ketchup dribbling down her chin, lettuce falling all over her lap and the table. Gary finished his in about 2 bites. When I finally managed to get mine into my mouth, I knew what hamburgers were supposed to taste like. It was well done, because all of us knew better than to eat rare burgers in the Bahamian Islands, but it wasn't the cardboard patty that you usually associate with well-done burgers. It was perfect. Michelle and I followed Gary around town, the 3 of us singing. I loved the fact that Michelle and her dad didn't think there was anything strange about singing in public. As we climbed back aboard Indian Summer for the trip back across the harbor, still full from the burgers, Gary said, "Jimmy Buffett, eat your heart out. This is the life." Land Kids, Narrows Marina, Virginia, summer of '87, age 8. The dock at the land next to the Wittigs was finished, but we'd fallen into a schedule of only spending the beginning of the summer and a month or 2 in the fall there. The months of July, August, and September were spent at Narrows Marina, the marina near Matthews, Virginia, that we'd discovered while waiting for the dock to be built. My parents may have felt that the lot, as we'd come to call our piece of property, was too isolated. Carolyn and I had friends at Narrows, kids that came to the marina from Richmond or Williamsburg on the weekends with their parents. The parents owned powerboats and partied heartily while they were there, and the kids ran wild through the playground and on the beach. There was a small pool with a sliding board and diving board and a lifeguard who was only there on weekends. Our parents didn't socialize much with the other parents, but they did have friends on boats at Narrows. They grilled chicken and steamed blue crabs and sat around the marina's picnic tables with their friends. Narrows Marina was the center of our world in the north, and Georgetown was the center in the south. My land friends talked about what they were doing in school and what they did at camp, and I talked about what happened in Georgetown. I sat in the cockpit on Friday evenings and watched the bridge that crossed over to Gwen's Island, the small island where the marina was situated. The land kids' parents usually got off work around 5, which meant they would arrive at the marina between 6 and 7. I watched the bridge until Jennifer and Julie's parents' minivan or Elizabeth's mom's white SUV crossed it, and then I ran and jumped off the boat and headed to the parking lot where they would pull in momentarily. I hovered while the parents unloaded their bags and carried them into the boat shed, waiting for the kids to be dismissed so we could run to the playground and push each other on the rusty merry-go-round. There was a family who had 2 boys, my sisters and my ages. They didn't come to the marina every weekend, but there was always a different dynamic. On the weekends that they did, Jennifer and Elizabeth, my 2 Virginia best friends, were normally happy to play my elaborate imagining games with me, or were content to sit with me in the sandbox and help dig hamster mazes, but they became distracted whenever the boys were there and wandered off to watch television on the boys' boat. Sometimes I followed them, but most of the time I didn't. Dad didn't like me watching television during the day. "Don't you think it's weird that you don't go to school?" Trey, the older of the 2 boys, asked me once, when I had gone to his boat. We all sat around the main salon of his parents' cabin cruiser, eating store-bought chocolate chip cookies from a bag and watching music videos on MTV. "I don't know," I said, reaching for another cookie. The cookies weren't nearly as good as the ones Mom made from scratch, but they were sweet and chocolatey and were better than no cookies at all. "I mean, you don't even know any of these songs," Trey said, motioning to the television, where Bon Jovi sang "Living on a Prayer." "Yes, I do," I said. "My granddad, Neale, had given me a small FM radio that summer, and every night before I fell asleep I hid it under my pillow, the volume low so as not to wake up Carolyn. I listened to country music most of the time, but sometimes I switched to rock." "How can you know about music when you're in the Bahamas all winter without any radio stations?" Trey wouldn't let it go. All the other kids had stopped paying attention to the TV and now stared at me. I thought about it. My dad always said that it wasn't important to know what music was in the top 10 or what clothes people were wearing. Think of all the other things you know how to do, like clean a conch or open a coconut, he'd say when I lamented not knowing as much about pop culture as other kids. "I listen to the radio when we are not in the Bahamas," I said. The bag of cookies was just out of my reach now, so I leaned across the floor to get it. My blonde hair fanned out over my arm as I stretched, and I noticed for a second the stark contrast of blonde hair on tanned kids. The first time my grandmom, June, had seen me that summer, she remarked that I looked like a little black kid with blonde hair. "Is it true that your mom grinds her own wheat to make flour?" Elizabeth piped up. This wasn't a badge of self-sufficiency to these kids. It was something else that was weird about me. "Yes," I said, feeling my cheeks start to burn. "And we catch our own fish for dinner. You don't do that, do you?" I glared around the room. The other kids simply looked at me, not knowing what to say. "I heard that your parents don't ever wear clothes when they are in the Bahamas," Trey said. "Don't know where you heard that. We all wear clothes. We just take them off sometimes when we're washing them or catching rainwater or something." I stuffed a cookie into my mouth and stared at the television. That evening, after the other kids had headed off to their houses in Richmond and Williamsburg, I climbed back aboard Chez Nous and trudged across the deck to the cockpit, where I kicked off my flip-flops and swung myself down the companionway. "Look," Mom said, standing up from the salon table where she'd been drawing all day in a large sketchbook. Artist pencils and erasers were scattered around her. She held a piece of paper with a stylized design drawn on it. "What's that?" "It's the design for the Kids Aboard flag," she said. I just looked at her. "There's a design contest in Cruising World," she said, pointing to an open magazine that sat on the table beside her. Next to it, the SSCA Bulletin, a blue and white newsletter, was also spread open to an article about how boats with kids aboard might locate other boats with kids aboard. The Seven Seas Cruising Association was a network of live-aboard cruisers spread all over the globe. Her parents had been members and had encouraged her to join for the sake of the cruising tips and advice that could be found in the bulletin. Cruisers mailed letters containing advice and anecdotes to the association's headquarters, which was just a non-Pacific mailing address in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the letters were published and distributed to subscribers. The association held annual gatherings and elected commodores, who proudly flew their burges from the rigging of their ocean-going vessels. "The idea," my mom said, "is that every boat that has kids aboard will be flying a flag with this design on it. That way we can all connect with each other and let the kids meet and play with each other." "Don't use that word," I said. "What, play?" She dropped the drawing back to the table and looked down at it, studying. "What's wrong with it?" "Little kids play," I said. "Carolyn and her friends play." "I'm bigger than that." "Okay, well, we can fly the flag and find other kids for you to hang out with," she said. I looked at her design on my way to the forward cabin. I liked it. It was simple and could be easily spotted from a distance, but I didn't tell her that I liked it. It just confirmed what I already knew. We were different. The land kids didn't need to fly flags to make their presence known. Boarding, the Bahamas, spring of '88, age 8. We left Gun Cay at 2 in the morning in the spring of '88, planning to cross the Gulf Stream while it was still dark, so we could reach Port Everglades, the inlet at Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in the morning. It was a nearly non-existent weather window, with a low-pressure system forming over top of us and threatening to develop into something tropical and disastrous. So we had to make sure we were in a safe harbor as soon as possible. Normally we wouldn't have left the Bahamas at night. We passed through the narrow cut between Cat and Gun Cay and headed into the open ocean. Mom and Dad told me to stay in bed, but the sound of the diesel engine, the clanking of the anchor chain and the bow, and the luff and slap of the mainsail sliding up the mast drew me up to the cockpit. The shallow banks glowed purple behind us, even at night. We could see the change in water color as we neared the drop-off. It went from lavender to purple to black under the bow. Off to our right, a few lights sparkled on Bimini, an island we avoided because of the shallow water, expensive marinas, and tourist crowd. "What's that?" Mom pointed to the dark stretch of water between Bimini and Gun Cay. Dad and I followed her gaze, and a natural glow swept the water, flickered off, then came on again, lighting up a round patch of the banks. "It looks like a searchlight," Dad said. He turned off the autopilot and altered our course away from the light. We couldn't see the boat that the light was coming from, whatever it was. It had no running lights. The light moved slowly back and forth, like whoever was on the boat was determined to cover every inch of seabed between Bimini and Cat. I was 8 then, but I didn't need to be told that something was going on that we didn't want to know about. I had heard stories of midnight drug drops, where planes would fly low over the water, dump cocaine and marijuana onto the Bahama banks, and speedboats would sweep in from the unlit islands nearby to pick up the packages. This was part of the landscape, and boaters who weren't involved knew to stay away. "Let's turn off the running lights," Dad said. "I don't want them seeing us." Mom ran down below and switched off the running lights, and we watched the searchlight's glow as it faded behind us on the banks. After a while, I went back to bed. Carolyn and I were still too young to take watch on our own, so we usually slept through these night passages. She had been knocked out with Dramamine. because nobody wanted to be stuck cleaning up puke on a rocking boat in the middle of the night. The smell of coffee brewing in the galley, the sideways pull of a tidal rip once we crossed the drop-off, then the steady movement of ocean swells made it hard for me to sleep. Mom had closed the forward hatch, the main source of ventilation into the V berth, so we wouldn't be drenched with sea water when Chenille buried her bow. The shape of her hull helped her to take waves more gracefully than most boats, but salt spray still found its way over the bow with each wave. I lay in bed, letting the up and down motion pull my body. When the boat fell off a wave, I pushed off the bed with my hands and let my body become suspended until we hit the trough. Then I crashed back into the mattress. I drifted in and out of sleep this way for what seemed like hours. At one point I stood and opened the hatch, wanting to smell the ocean. The dirt-rich smell of the Bahamas came in with the salt, so I knew we hadn't gone far. It was sometime around the new moon, so there wasn't any light other than our navigation lights, which Mom had turned back on. Through the hatch I could see the red and green reflection of the bow lights against the full jib. We were sailing nicely, and the swells had evened out, so I figured we must be close to the Gulf Stream. I drifted into sleep again, but jerked out of it when I heard footsteps pounding on the companionway stairs. Mom took them two at a time and rushed to turn off the lights at the chart table and in the galley. I leaned out of the bed to see what she was doing. The whites of her eyes glowed against the black cabin. She had her life vest on, but she covered it with a black sweatshirt. "Mom," I said, swinging my feet around and onto the cabin sole. Shush. She moved faster than I'd ever seen her move before. She held the key to the gun locker in one hand, and she put the other on my shoulder. "Go back to bed," she said. "Just pretend to sleep." She looked over at Carolyn, who had her head turned to face the hole. Carolyn's ribcage rose and fell in steady sleeping rhythm. "What's going on?" I pulled myself back into the V berth. "Don't come out on deck," she said. "Just stay here." She shut the door, then changed her mind and opened it, latching it into place. She looked at me and clenched her jaw, grinding her teeth like she did when she was stressed. Dad's silhouette filled the companionway hatch, and he hissed down at her. "Mel," he said, "hurry up." He held a heavy flashlight, the kind police officers used to knock people out. He had turned the lights in the cockpit off as well, so the space behind him was gray, the only light a green glow from the engine gauges on the instrument panel. Mom disappeared into the aft cabin, and I turned so that I was on my stomach. I leaned as far out as I could without falling out of bed. I heard the teak door of Dad's gun locker slamming open. She held a small handgun up to where Dad's arm hung suspended in the darkness above her head. I didn't know anything about guns, but I knew that Dad had never taken this one out of the locker before. She stood like that, arms stretched, gun offered, for what seemed like 5 long minutes. Dad kept his hand unnaturally still, then dropped it to his side without reaching for the gun. "No," he said, "if they're smugglers and they see us with a gun, we are dead. Put it back, but leave the cabinet unlocked." Mom retreated to the aft cabin. I wanted to get out of bed and at least go to the main cabin where I could look out the window, but something in Dad's voice made me stay where I was. I couldn't move. I felt like my arms and legs were pinned in place. Night terrors later in life would give me the same sensation. I couldn't see Mom and Dad out the hatch anymore. The sound of the wind and the water was overpowered by a wild roar of engines, and the beam of a strong searchlight swept over Chenille. I heard Dad on the megaphone asking someone to please identify themselves. The roar got closer, and then it was right alongside, and our boat rocked violently and something thudded on deck. I wanted to move now more than ever, but I still couldn't. Dad's voice boomed through the megaphone again. "This is a private vessel. We have 2 small children aboard. Please identify yourself." I wondered how Carolyn could sleep. She sighed and rolled over, but her eyes stayed shut. Outside, voices echoed and bounced, distorted by the night. I couldn't understand a word they were saying. I heard Dad's voice and realized that he wasn't speaking into the megaphone anymore. The hull of another boat squeaked against ours. "Just don't wake the girls up." I could hear Dad now, but couldn't tell what the other people were saying. Footsteps heavier than my parents' pounded over my head. A silhouette filled the companionway, an unfamiliar man, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt that didn't conceal his holster and gun. Two more stood behind them. Could they be pirates? I felt bile rise in my stomach and a strange twinge of excitement, too. What were these unfamiliar and young and somewhat glamorous-looking men doing on our boat in the middle of the night? The one in the companionway jumped downstairs, and I faked sleep. I pulled the cover around my ears and closed my eyes halfway so I could watch the man. He walked the length of the boat, sweeping the beam of a flashlight into corners and opening cabinets and peering inside. He made his way into the bedroom. The man was less than 2 feet away from me now, and I stared at him through squinted eyes. He opened my clothes locker and pushed aside my Barbie dolls. I must have moved because he turned to look at me. He was young, almost a teenager, and he smiled. His teeth were bright white, and I thought he was handsome, like a Disney prince, but didn't like him there in my bedroom in the middle of the night. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," he said. "Everything's okay." The two other men searched the rest of the boat, and Mom made them coffee. Dad stayed on deck. They took extra time in the aft cabin, and I heard them banging around in the gun locker and talking in clipped sentences. Dad showed them a stack of papers, and their voices relaxed a little bit. The next morning, once we had reached the shallow U.S. waters on the west side of the Gulf Stream, Dad told me that they were U.S. drug enforcement officers. They had gotten a tip about a drop-off of Bimini, and they had seen us leaving the area and chased us down. They came up with no lights, Dad said. He hadn't looked right all day, like he hadn't slept in a week. The veins on his neck were swollen, and his nostrils flared. "I almost shot at them," he said. "They could have been anybody." When we reached Port Everglades and the hustle of Fort Lauderdale, Dad made Carolyn and me sit out on the deck and wave at the Coast Guard, Customs, and Marine Police boats that patrolled the inlet. "They aren't going to pull us over if they see that we are a family boat," he said. We cruised by them just fine, Carolyn and I waving and looking like innocent boat kids. We found out later that the DEA made one of the biggest cocaine busts of the year a few nights later off Bimini. Even though the 80s were almost over, drug traffic between Miami and the Bahamas was still relatively heavy. Kids aboard, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, fall of '89, age 10. We were docked in Fort Lauderdale in the fall of 1989 when we met Rod. He came aboard Chez Nous without being invited, in the usual manner of live-aboard kids. I was 9 and Carolyn was 7. We'd been flying the kids aboard flag. Mom had sewn a flag with the winning design. Someone else had won, although her design had been a close runner-up and had been featured in a magazine article, and we'd started seeing the flags on more and more boats up and down the coast and in the Bahamas. Rod made all kinds of noise on deck, and Dad popped out from underneath the flipped-up galley steps. What the hell was that? He was busy installing our first water maker, a contraption that would pump salt water up from the sea and turn it into fresh, so that we would no longer have to depend on finding abandoned cisterns or collecting rainwater on the deck. Dad was beginning to make a little bit of supplemental money writing articles, and he added equipment to our boat as necessity arose and finances allowed. He had a 3/4-inch hose in one hand and a screwdriver in the other. "It sounds like some kind of animal," Mom said. She pushed the companionway hatch open, and Carolyn and I climbed up the stairs behind her. Rod stood in the cockpit holding a plastic machine gun. "Hi," he said, then, "Oh, you just have girls." "Excuse me, but what's wrong with girls? I was ready for battle." Rod just stood there in the cockpit, looking down the barrel of his toy gun. He was shorter than me, had round cheeks and a buzz cut, and something about him reminded me of Bart Simpson. Maybe it was the skateboard he'd propped on a banyan tree next to our boat. "Well," he finally said, "nothing's wrong with girls, but I wanted to play war." He set the gun down on the cockpit cushion. "I guess we don't have to," he said. "You can shoot Melanie's Barbies." Carolyn said. Mom and I both turned to look at her, surprised to hear her talk. She was usually shy around new kids. I stepped up on her foot. "Where are your parents?" Mom looked around the dock, which was really just a stretch of seawall along the New River where the city of Fort Lauderdale made a few extra bucks tying up sailboats. "On the boat, smoking dope," Rob said. He puffed his chest out and looked at all our faces to see what kind of reaction he'd gotten from us. Then he pointed the gun over to a Taiwanese canoe stern sloop that was docked 3 boats up the river from us. I covered my mouth and sucked back a giggle. This guy was ballsy to say something like that, and about his own parents. It struck me as hilarious. This, after all, was a world where one false accusation or one stray joint could land a cruiser in jail for supposed smuggling of drugs. To hear him speak so callously about something that my parents handled with such righteousness and delicacy made me feel like I would burst with excitement. Mom glared at him for a moment before saying, "Do they know you're over here?" She didn't address the dope comment, but I was sure she would question his mother about it in private. "Sure," he said. A woman with long blonde hair popped out of the companionway of the sloop, which was named Wind, and waved over at us. A black cat shot out of the hatch next to her and jumped onto the seawall. "That's Geraldine," Rod said. "She's 19 years old, and she's blind. She'll claw your eyes out, too, if you're not careful." Rod's parents were Lynn and Joe. Joe was a Vietnam vet with a bad back, who received enough money from the government to pay for the boat and to keep Lynn and Rod happy. Rod announced to Carolyn and me later that Joe wasn't his dad, so he was technically a bastard. Lynn was almost a foot taller than Joe, and she wore Western shirts and jeans. If she hadn't been living on a sailboat, I think she would have worn cowboy boots too. I liked her clothes, and I followed her around so I could pay close attention to everything she did and said. Once Mom had talked to Lynn and determined that it was okay for us to play with Rod, we poured off the boat and into a large banyan tree. We weren't allowed to go any farther than the tree because Fort Lauderdale was a dangerous place, full of child molesters and bad people and God knows what else. We strung a hammock up under the banyan tree, and the 3 of us climbed in and rocked it back and forth until it flipped over and dumped us onto the hard-packed Florida's dirt. It was quite quiet in the banyan tree, and nobody bothered us. The New River, with its boat traffic and horns and current and mishmash of wakes, flowed past us, and we pretended to be Greek gods. Rod, of course, was Zeus, and Carolyn cried when he threw a lightning bolt at her. I was Aphrodite, which pissed Rod off because he said I was too fat to be Aphrodite. Rod's parents and ours decided to give us 2 days off school because we were all ahead on our coursework. None of us knew when we would be around other kids again. Rod was a Calvert school kid too, a grade behind me, so we'd all read the same books and learned the same things. We went from playing Greek gods to pretending to be hobbits to creating our own mythology in which Rod was the captain of a ship named Argo, represented by the hammock. I was the beautiful but fat cook, and Carolyn was the ship's cat. Dad finished installing the water maker in those 2 days, and the engine room of Chenoo was now lined with heavy-duty reverse osmosis filters and hoses running from through holes to the filters, then to our water tank. Our time with Rod was over. We steamed out of the New River in tears the day we crossed to the Bahamas, but Rod was on the way to Georgetown. We knew we'd see him again in a couple of months after we had spent our alone time in Pipe Creek and at Compass Cay. Dad liked to have his own time of peace before we made our way to the social madness of Georgetown, so there would be days and days of school in the morning, diving and shelling in the afternoon, and quiet dinners around the table at Chez Nous before we would be around kids again. Gurley Dive, Georgetown, Bahamas, winter of '91, age 11. The monument on Stocking Island was always the first thing we saw of Georgetown. It rose out of the Exuma Sound off our bow, a green hill with a flat face, topped with a crumbling concrete beacon. Nobody knew what the monument stood for, but it marked the graves of many well-loved boat pets, including our first hamster, Scruffy. It was probably built as a navigational beacon for island-hopping schooners and sloops back in the days before Loren and GPS made navigation something you did by pushing buttons. I got giddy when I saw it. To me, the monument meant other kids. It meant volleyball beach, bonfires, the end of long days on the boat with nobody but my family for company. Georgetown was called Chicken Harbor by other boaters because people always stopped there on their way to the Caribbean with the intention of provisioning in the small town of Great Exuma or making a few repairs. Most of them chickened out and ended up staying for months. It was that kind of place. When Dad saw the monument, his ears turned red and the vein in his neck started pumping the way it did when his temper was starting to flare. To him, Georgetown represented everything that he and Mom had moved onto the boat to escape: social structures, crowds, bad influences on the kids. The winter I was 11 and Carolyn was 9 was the first time I remember caring about my looks. When we caught the first glimpse of the monument looming off our bow, I ran below to put on a pair of shorts that wasn't ripped and a pink tank top. It was the kind I'd seen on the cover of 17 magazine, in the aisle at Publix back in the States, a skinny blonde model with tanned shoulders and a giraffe neck had sported the turtleneck top as she lounged on a beach chair. I took my hair out of its ponytail and brushed it over my shoulders, wetting my hairbrush to calm the flyaway strands. I squeezed some strawberry-flavored lip gloss out of the tube I kept by my bunk and rushed out on deck to see if the monument had gotten closer. Carolyn sat on the bow, pouting. I joined her. "Look at all the masts," I said. A forest of sailboat masts was beginning to appear underneath the monument. Dad changed course slightly as we entered the harbor. The channel was narrow and required his concentration. 1 or 2 boats went up on the reef each year, usually because they came in at night or during bad weather, relying too heavily on poorly surveyed U.S. government charts or the boat's electronics. Mom chattered on the VHF radio, calling all her friends to let them know we were here. She'd changed clothes too, preparing for the inevitable onslaught of dinghies we would face as soon as we anchored. "I don't like Georgetown," Carolyn said. "Why?" I thought. She must have been crazy. "Too many people," she said. "You're going to have to start liking people one of these days," I said. "Did you dress up for Rod or something?" She wrinkled her nose the way she did when she was pretending to be a rabbit. I didn't think her question warranted an answer. The harbor opened up turquoise and violet in front of us, and Dad steered through the deep channel toward the monument. We dropped anchor off of Hamburger Beach, almost directly below the monument. Dad stood on the bow and yelled back to Mom, who had replaced him at the helm, to put the boat in reverse and jerk the anchor. "God damn it," he said, when the anchor pulled out of the grassy seabed for the second time. This was one of the reasons why he hated Georgetown. The holding was terrible. It took 3 tries to get the plow anchor to bite. After we were anchored, he hid in the engine room for slightly longer than necessary, checking the fluid levels on the Perkins. By the time the sun went down over Great Exuma, we'd received at least a dozen invitations to cocktail parties on people's boats, potlucks on the beach, other kids' birthday parties. The social onslaught of Georgetown had begun. "We are only going to stay here a week," Dad said at dinner, but that's what he always said, and we knew not to take him seriously. The next morning I woke up around 6:30 to hear Dad talking on the VHF. Mom was already up, and the tea kettle whistled in the galley where she was, heating water for instant coffee. I dragged myself out of my bunk and up to the main cabin. "Can you be ready in 20 minutes?" I didn't recognize the other man's voice on the VHF. "Maybe make it 30, Dad said. I need to eat breakfast. The light won't be good for another half an hour." "Okay, back to 16, the other voice said. "Hey, Tom," a woman's voice broke into the VHF conversation. "Morning," he said. "Sorry to be eavesdropping, but you know how it is. Can Rod come along with you guys? He hasn't been diving in a while." It was Lynn. I didn't know why she would apologize for listening. Everybody knew that the VHF wasn't private, and listening to other people's conversations was part of everyday life out here. "Sure," he said. "I'll run him over there in the dink so you all don't have to come get him," Lynn said. "I'm going to let him have the day off school so he can go with you." Dad tuned the radio back to 16, the standby and calling channel, and disappeared into the aft cabin, mumbling something underneath his breath about babysitting other people's kids. "Where are they going?" I sat on the galley steps and watched Mom stir raisins into a pot of oatmeal. The smell nauseated me. "Diving," she said. "I didn't know there was any place to dive around here. They're going offshore," she said. "Can I go?" "Better ask your dad." She spooned some of the oatmeal into a bowl and handed it to me so I could put it on the table. "If you are going, you'd better eat some of this." My stomach rolled over and I turned away from the oatmeal so I couldn't smell it. The raisins looked like black insects in the mush. I decided to go without breakfast. I also decided not to ask Dad about diving. I changed into a bathing suit and a long t-shirt, put my hair into a ponytail, and hoped nobody would notice that I hadn't brushed it, and spread some sunscreen on my nose. I hopped up the stairs to the cockpit and got my diving stuff together: mask, snorkel, fins, weight, belt, spear, Hawaiian sling. We didn't scuba dive because it was illegal to spearfish with tanks. Dad had a tank, but he only used it when he had to repair something underwater. Lynn zipped up in the dinghy and barely slowed down to let Rod jump off. Rod waved at his mom and stood there on the deck with his mesh gear bag slung over his shoulder. "You're not going, are you?" he said. "Yup. This isn't a girly dive," he said. "What's a girly dive?" "You know, shallow water to look at pretty fish," he said. "We are going to go kill stuff." I picked up my Hawaiian sling and stretched out the cord, pretending that the spear was cocked into place, and let it go in Rod's direction. "I'll shoot you if you don't shut up," I said. When Dad came upstairs, he looked at me funny and asked, "Are you going with us?" "Yes." I glared at him and then at Rod, and picked up my dive bag and spear. "Okay," Dad said. We skimmed across the harbor toward the inlet in a hard-bottomed inflatable dinghy that belonged to a guy named Sean, the man Dad had been talking to on the VHF. Sean was a profound professional captain, hired to run and take care of someone else's boat. Dad had met him back in Pipe Creek the week before. I thought his graying beard and deep tan made him look the part of a professional captain. His dive gear was all new, and the Yamaha outboard on the dink was the latest model. I sat in the narrow V of the bow and leaned out over the water, looking at the coral heads as they flew underneath us. It was flat calm, and I could make out the details of each fish, black spots running down the side of a barracuda, the purple stripes on a triggerfish's mouth. Sean cut the engine off just outside the inlet. Large swells lifted and dropped the dinghy, but their surfaces were glass smooth. "There are a couple of good reefs down there," he said, pulling on his fins. "Let's throw a line in and drift." I spit into my mask and rummed my saliva around inside to keep it from fogging. By the time I had finished, everybody else was in the water. Sean and Rod swam ahead of the dink, and Dad held on to the line that was tied to the bow. I sat on the edge and let my fins trail in the water. I tried to guess the depth, but the sun was behind the clouds, and I figured it probably wasn't as deep as it looked. I hoped Dad had taken a thorough look around for sharks and barracudas. As I slipped into the water, I thought about my mom and sister and Len. I wondered why none of them wanted to be out here. They all seemed to be content back on the boats, reading, studying, doing boat work. Maybe Mom was working on one of her paintings. She'd been commissioned to do a large yacht portrait for some yacht club yuppie back in Virginia. I wondered if something was wrong with me for preferring the company of a bunch of fish-killing guys to the more civilized company of my mom and sister. I spun in a complete circle to let my eyes adjust to the filtered light underneath the water. I was looking for sharks, even though I didn't want to admit it. The circle of visibility spread out about 70 feet on all sides, then faded into gray-blue shadow, where coral heads and schools of amberjacks loomed against the muted rays of sunlight. Rod and Dad took turns pulling the dink, swimming slowly underneath it, holding a line tied to the bow, and Sean did most of the diving. I watched him dive and come up with a 20-pound grouper thrashing at the end of his spear, a cloud of fish blood trailing behind him. 2 barracudas followed him up, circling underneath, but they slunk back into the shadows as soon as the grouper was in the dinghy. I wanted to get out of the water, but didn't. I tried not to think about the guy I'd seen on Volleyball Beach last year. He'd been diving off Andros a few months before, and a reef shark had taken a chunk out of his leg. His whole calf was concave, and he half ran, half limped around the sand volleyball court. He'd been spearfishing, and the shark had come up out of nowhere. He'd never even seen it, just felt something hit him hard, and then he looked back, and a chunk of his leg was gone. Shark attacks were like that. I was an expert on them. I'd read every book about sharks that I could convince Mom to buy me. Somehow it made me feel better to know what I was up against. The bloodier the pictures in the books, the more I liked them. I wanted to study shark behavior someday, and I fantasized about going down in one of those steel cages while a great white gnashed its teeth against the bars. I'd read that shark attacks didn't even hurt until afterwards. When they happened, you just felt numb. Something nudged against my shoulder, and I jumped. It was Dad. He pointed down at the bottom with his spear, waving it towards a sandy patch between clumps of dead elkhorn coral. There were forests of dead coral all over the Bahamas, where Bahamian fishermen had bleached the reefs in order to chase grouper and lobster out from under ledges and into waiting nets. I had to let my eyes adjust all over again to see what he was pointing at. There were dozens of conch spread out across the sand. They looked tiny from the surface, but their shells had the flared lips of full-grown queens. Dad stuck his head above the surface and motioned with his thumb for me to do the same. "I don't think I can go that deep," he said. "My ears can't handle it. Why don't you try it?" He'd injured his eardrums as a child and always wore earplugs when diving. "How deep is it?" I tried not to swallow water. "I don't know, 45 at least." We ducked back under, and I took a couple of deep breaths through my snorkel. I didn't know at that point that you're supposed to hyperventilate before you dive. I didn't know any of the technicalities or rules or fancy terms. I just knew to clear my ears when they started to hurt, which was a matter of instinct. The conchs were huge, some over 15 inches from spiral to tip, and their shells were thick from living with that much water pressed down on top of them. They were crusted with corals and tufts of seaweed, and my hand looked small and white, like it didn't belong. When I reached out for the closest one, I scooped up two, one under each arm, and kicked towards the surface. The dinghy and the other divers were small black spots against the round sphere of sunlight above me. Rod dove with me on the next trip down, but he only made it halfway. To the bottom, I came up with two more conchs. Dad tapped me on the shoulder after my fourth trip. "What?" I said. "You didn't see them?" "See what?" "The reef sharks," he said. He didn't need to say anything else before I was climbing into the dinghy. Where were they? I pulled my mask off and wrapped my arms around my chest, suddenly cold. "They followed you down that last time," he said. He pulled himself into the tank, and Rod and Sean followed. The whites of Rod's eyes seemed twice their normal size through his mask. "How many?" I said. I was glad I'd skipped breakfast because I knew that had I eaten it, the oatmeal would have come back up. "Two," Dad said. "They circled right over you a couple of times. He tried to chase them away," Rod said, pointing at my dad, who was peering into the glass-bottomed bucket we always took with us on diving trips. "They're still down there," Dad said. I leaned over the bucket, pushing him aside. Through the scratched glass I could see the two sharks, small gray silhouettes against the sandy bottom. They swam in unison, their bodies moving as naturally as the water around them. Sean laughed. "I don't think they were hungry. They were just looking," he smiled, white teeth against tan skin, and started the outboard. And Dad set the look bucket down in the dinghy's bilge. Rod pulled a towel around his shoulders and spit into the water. "My sinuses were hurting," he said. "That's why I couldn't dive as deep as you." Dad rolled his eyes at me, checking first to make sure Rod wasn't looking. "How deep was it anyway?" I said. "I can tell you." Sean flipped on a handheld depth sounder and dropped the transducer in the water. 53 feet, he said. "Why didn't you tell us you had a depth sounder?" Dad said. "Because none of you would have gotten into that water if you'd known how deep it was." Sean covered the grouper and the conch with a wet towel and turned the throttle until the dinghy was planing back towards the harbor. When we neared Chenu, the smell of just-baked whole wheat bread trailed downwind from the open hatches. I was hungry now.